Welcome back to Business Week here on the Rise News. I'm joined now by Damilare Adesola, Associate Director, Control Risks, to help us review some of our top stories in more detail. Good morning, Dami. Welcome.
Morning,
Great to have you on the show.
Lovely
now,
to
the
be
first
here.
story we want to discuss is InfraCredit saying that it's going to be issuing 1 trillion naira worth of guarantees. What does that tell us about where infrastructure financing in Nigeria is heading?
I think it's great news. It's very good development, especially when you consider how infrastructure has been previously sponsored or resourced from government budget and fund allocation, and we know the fiscal constraint that the government has been facing for many years. And so moving this to sort of the responsibility of the institutional investors, such as pension funds, insurance companies, unlocking that domestic capital in a way is really significant to really filling some of those infrastructure financing gaps. And so they're looking at about $703 million in guarantees over the next 4 years, supporting infrastructure projects, everything from ports to energy to electricity, and that would be very significant for the
and
sector.
it mentioned sort of looser leverage rules and easing borrowing costs. Do those things actually really help to crowd in private capital?
It does because when you consider the fact that some of these, typically the typical lenders, the bankers, don't really sponsor construction projects or anything that is not tied to a product or a good. But when you bring in the long-term capital that comes from these institutional investors, the InfraCredit comes to then de-risk that by providing that leverage, by backing some of these projects, and getting their funding from the NSI, and even some of these pension funds are also shareholders holding up to 40% in there. It really does a great deal to pull them in, and I think they've been doing a great job just in the last 4 years, because the organization has been in operation for a long time now, but it seems like in the last 3 to 4 years they've really got their act together and are doing significantly better now.
Yeah, great season for infrastructure development in the country. Let's scoot over now to Trump and Canada and Mexico. I almost feel like the Canada tariff threat is sort of a fallout of the World Economic Forum when Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, gave this incredible, well, I would say like a retort to Trump, even though it was veiled. But I mean, this opens up another front, which the world has become so used to. But it seems like this is a way of actually permanently building tensions with allies. So now we have aviation now in the mix and energy-related products. So tell us about what this new front in the tariff tension means.
So this has been ongoing maybe for like a good 12 to 16 months since Trump came into power, and essentially what we are seeing is just a disturbance of the global order, where previously or regional agreements, such as the NATO agreements or any sort of alliances that were previously there, moving away from multilateralism and the power that the UN previously had, and essentially moving to that one-on-one personality politics, where it's about the stakeholders who are in the room. It's about showcasing the sort of common interests as opposed to the shared values, and essentially just the unpredictability that comes with. And we're not seeing the end of tariffs. Tariffs is going to continue to happen, and Trump is going to continue to push for more. I mean, he did say essentially that, and we're seeing more with the comment from Canada that they're willing to sort of put their foot down and essentially disagree to being bullied.
Yeah, and it's interesting now, if these tariffs go ahead, who absorbs it? Is it U.S. consumers? Is it corporate margins? Is it global supply chains?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of the three. So definitely profit margins will shrink for the suppliers and the people who are providing these products, but a lot of that will be offset into the prices at the end of the day. But because the price goes up, it's going to affect the global supply chain, and us here in Africa that are really at the end of the supply chain, where we're mostly consumers than we are producers. It means a lot for like inflation, and so that's where a lot of different economies are moving to sort of delink themselves, not just from the global system, but also from the US specifically, where there's significant supply chains, so there's wheat, things that are staple foods, energy, all the different resources that they need to essentially keep their country running. At the very base, they're sort of delinking it from these systems as much as possible. It's definitely a long-term goal, and I'm curious to see how countries mobilize, because I think the mobilization needs to happen in essentially to sort of increase the bargaining power that some of these bodies have against the US.
Okay, so here's an interesting story. China has actually moved from being a net lender to a net collector, tax collector, debt collector.
Yes.
But I'm wondering whether this is the fact that African economies and their governments and representatives are not negotiating in the right way, or whether China is now just seeking to consolidate its own focus on domestic investment, giving the headwinds in its own economy. Is this a permanent shift? Or is it just because all this debt is reaching maturity at the same time? So the figures we're getting seem to suggest that it's now a collective repayment.
Yes,
right.
it's the figures, and it's because it's reaching a collective moment, but it's also because they have sort of changed their economic strategy. Some of the local banks that were previously exploring, so 2020 to 2028, 2012 to 2018, the average investment per year from Chinese firms was about 10 billion into Africa.
Across the entire continent.
Across the entire continent annually. But now in 2024, the most recent figures has dropped to $2.5 billion. And so that just shows you what that means. And so there was a time that they were sort of desperate and looking for these green frontiers as a new way to make money. But now, because of the headwinds that have happened domestically, they've had to sort of shift that strategy and just focus on collecting those debts. And so countries like Angola is still the primary destination for Chinese investments. And they're also moving away from sort of the development focus, so the airport type structures, to investment that could actually yield results. So whether it's energy, grids, and on some of those.
And it's interesting because, we talked about the New World Order. We've seen countries like Canada and even the UK reach out to China, and giving the US pullback, whether it's international organizations or aid. Who is Africa's next frontier partner in terms of negotiations of trade? We obviously saw Tinubu going to Turkey. He was also in the UAE. What then becomes the partnership strategy for a country like Nigeria if we're even seeing these kinds of figures from a traditional historic partner like China for infrastructure? What should Nigeria be doing, positioning itself
I think first of all, I would start domestically. What we are doing with InfraCredit is really great. And a lot of the private sector looking at actually investing in some of these banks. We saw what Sterling Bank did last year with the investment that they made in Sycamore and some of these other initiatives. So that's the first thing, the private sector investing locally and digitization of some sectors that is ongoing in energy, for example. But in addition to that, we are seeing a lot more interest from the Gulf region, also from India. Personally, in control risk, I've handled more India, projects or India-backed projects in the last 12 months that I have in the last 5 years. And that just shows you where the interest is coming from and where some of these investors, I know that Tinubu also did a roadshow in India in the first few months of his time in government. And so it's really just a diversification of that pool, but also just looking to see where you can showcase the value. And it's not just the bargaining conversation has really just shifted now, and it's really just how much you can show that you can bring back the results. That you're
very,
seeing.
very interesting times. So many different geopolitical dynamics and how that interacts with capital flows. But speaking of financing and capital flows, Ghana's cocoa board is one of the last few remaining strong commodity boards for soft commodities in the West Africa sub-region. Now it's reconsidering its financing model. What has caused this reconsideration? So
it previously used to depend on syndicated loans that were mainly foreign sourced, and it recently shifted in 2024 to having upfront payments from global buyers. And so what that has meant, on one hand, it's put more bargaining power in the hands of the buyers, but it has also caused some delays in payments. And so now a lot of farmers in this season have not been paid for the cocoa that they've supplied, and even some of the cocoa hasn't even been sold and is rotting away. And so essentially, they're looking to see, they're considering going back to the loan system. But the issue with that, while it ensured that everybody was paid, they were having to pay interest rates of up to $144 million every year.
Wow.
And it's how much is their revenue, that they're going to be paying that much. And so there needs to, I think the key issue there is really the pricing system and how they have a fixed pricing system. And so yes, they're trying to protect the farmers, and at the beginning they sort of promise the farmers a particular price, and they stick to that price no matter what happens in the market. And cocoa is currently at a 2-year low, and so that's partially the challenges that they're facing now. And so there are a lot of different examples. I mean, we have Brazil and how the model for their sugar. We have Vietnam and the model for their rice. That one is smallholder farmer based, just like Ghana's cocoa is. And so there are a lot of different case studies that they can pull from, but I don't think going back to the syndicated loans is the best best. It was causing default and causing a lot of issues with the government as well, because we know that cocoa is one of the primary sources of revenue for the Ghanaian government, and so there are a lot of different conversations that they need to have essentially to make sure that the main reason why they're there isn't being pushed aside for something else.
Indeed, and of course rising debt pressures. Ghana as a country has just come out of this debt restructuring. It's finally back on a stable economic footing. You don't want any major sources of derailment.
Exactly.
Air traffic in Africa is up 10.3%. But with these rising passenger numbers, is this actually converting to profitability for the airlines? We often hear about, we can debate ticket prices on airlines in Africa. But what is this figure telling us about what is really going on?
I think it's telling us, because it's not just December, it's been coming up for some time. I think it's telling us that there's an increased capacity. So a lot of them have introduced more airlines. And when we have the FX issues that we've had in a lot of different countries, despite the price, it's easier to just get the tickets from the local suppliers. But I think beyond the passenger traffic, the cargo traffic has also increased. And we've seen I think it's both 10% for the increase in cargo traffic and passenger traffic in the last month. And it's way above the global average, which was about 4 or 5%. And so it's essentially showing that, that interconnectedness that we're seeking for Africa is increasingly becoming, a reality. Yes, the price is still a factor. It's still cheaper to fly to Germany than it is to fly to Kenya today, or it's still cheaper to ship a product to Germany than it is to ship a product to Kenya. So there's still conversations about those corridors and moving to not just the air cargo but also the shipment.
And do you think these figures sort of change the investment case for investing in aviation infrastructure, or do the sort of old issues still linger?
The old issues still linger. Historically, the aviation sector operates on very small margins, and so it's the volume that really drives it.
Sure.
And so you look at some of the other countries, so we're looking at Emirati and Emirates. It needs to be driven by the locals. It needs to be the locals that are using it. The British Airways and the British use British Airways, and so we haven't gotten to that point yet of sort of loyalty by the nationals using that airline. And until it gets to that point where you have that traffic from the locals driving it, I don't think it's that investor attractiveness is going to come up. But it's going in the right direction, and eventually they could get to that point.
Fantastic. Great insights as always, Damilare Adesola from Control Risk Associate Director. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Baraka.